Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another daily devotion. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for taking time to be in God's Word. It is the source of life, as we hear from John's Gospel, which is focused on the Word and baptism and the Lord's Supper. Today we're getting into John chapter 9. So I posted the text in the description of the video and in the podcast as well, and you can follow along there as I read. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the Pool of Siloam." This word means sent. So he went and washed and came home seeing. This is the gospel of the Lord. So a couple interesting interactions here. The first is between the disciples and Jesus. As they walk past this man who is blind from birth, the disciples ask this question: who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, let's just try to understand the question, first of all. You have to go back to the Old Testament and understand that God, when he revealed his name to his people, said, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, etc., etc. It's a long whole thing. You can look it up in Exodus. But one part that you want to focus on is where it says that he remembers the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate him. Now, that would have been ringing in the ears of these Jewish men who thought, okay, so there is sometimes a temporal or a worldly, earthly punishment for sin. Now, before we talk about how that plays out in this specific situation, let's just first acknowledge that that is true. That when we receive suffering in this world, it is because of sin, right? Sometimes I think we forget that sin has a direct effect on our life, that it continues to break the world. That when we sin, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. People are hurt by it. I think this maybe plays out most obviously, at least from my life, when I think about the people that I serve who struggle with pornography. Pornography is an easy sin to say, this doesn't really affect anybody. But it actually does. When you think about the actors and actresses who go through horrible conditions in order to put together that content, many of whom do it against their will because they're either forced into it by some sex trading, or who do it because it's the only thing that they have left in their life, and they suffer from all sorts of depression and substance abuse, and many commit suicide. If there is a demand for that content, there are going to be more people who do that terrible thing that is destroying their life. And besides those actors and actresses, you also have your family, your marriage, your children, people who are affected by that sin as soon as they find out. And even if they don't find out, they're affected by the way that pornography affects your mood, affects your worldview, affects how you view yourself. Sin always causes havoc. We as Christians ought to think that as soon as we sin, we are putting ourselves in a dangerous spot. It's easy for us as grace-believing Christians to think, if I sin, God is going to forgive me and everything's going to be okay. And yes, God is going to forgive you and everything is going to be okay. But as the author of the Hebrews says very clearly, if we are deliberately continuing to sin, there's no more grace left for sin. We ought to be very careful if we are ever even considering the idea of willfully going against God's law. Because not only will that destroy our lives here on earth, it will also destroy our faith and eventually lead us away from God. I think we have to have the confidence that comes from the gospel that God is going to love us, God is going to forgive us, God is going to hold us in his hand, but that we also have the very real strength to leave God, to run away from him in rebellion still, even though he has saved us by his gospel. Now, for these guys, they're thinking to themselves, okay, well, somebody sinned because there's a terrible suffering happening in this guy's life. It might be his parents because God visits the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. Or it could be that this guy sinned himself. Now, if you think about that a little bit deeper, it gets a little bit weird because you think, so if that's true, that this man sinned and therefore he suffers for his sin, but he was born blind, does that mean that he somehow sinned in the womb? Or that somehow he was going to sin in his life, and so God preemptively gave him this suffering? A couple things to pull out from this. First of all, the disciples are unintentionally affirming the sinfulness of a human being in the womb. David says this in the Psalms. Psalm 51, I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. In other words, my sin in the womb leads me to only deserve death and punishment, both in earth and in eternity. So they're saying, well, it's possible, I guess, that this baby, before it was born, had sin, and therefore that sin somehow affected its existence as a born human. Or they say, well, maybe it's because something was going to happen in his life, and so God preemptively did this. Maybe, maybe not. But Jesus is going to focus on not the man's sickness as a result of sin, but as the possibility for God to do great things. And for us as people, we like to try to rationalize everything, to say, like, this is why this happened, or, if this wouldn't have happened, it would have been different. God doesn't work that way. Yes, he remembers sin, and he remembers that sin deserves punishment, and he allows suffering and punishment to come into our lives so that we turn to him and say, I only can hope for the grace of God and the salvation which Jesus earns. But he also lets these things happen so that he can show his glory, right? That's what Jesus says. He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. In other words, this wasn't his father's fault. It wasn't his fault. It was so that I could come and show you something awesome, so that I could show my glory. Is that how we think about our lives? Do you think about the things that you don't like about yourself? The things that other people don't like about you? The things that you wish were different? The things you wish that had been done differently? As opportunities for God to show his grace? For chances for God to be glorified? Or do you think of them as hindrances to your will or your wants or your desires, your hopes for your future? When Jesus wants you to consider that the former is better. Why are you divorced? So that God can show the glory of himself in you. Why do you struggle to remember things? So that God can show his glory through you. Why can't you seem to get a spouse? So that God can show his glory through you. Why do you have back trouble? So that God can show his glory through you. Why do you not have the type of money that you used to have? So that God can show his glory through you. Why isn't your church growing? So that God can show his glory through you. And so on and so on. God sees far further into the future than we do. And he also makes all things work for the good of those who love him. And that is not to say necessarily earthly good, but eternal good. That either that person would be saved, or that the people that person knows would be saved. If you think about your sufferings right now, would you be willing to go through those things if they meant you were guaranteed to go to heaven? Or that maybe they meant that somebody you knew was guaranteed to go to heaven? You have that promise. That's literally what Jesus says to you. He says these sufferings are producing character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint. In other words, these things are the sign that because you are a Christian and because you are not of this world, because you are seated with Christ in the heavenly realms, this world is going to attack you and hate you and hurt you, but you have the promise that all these things are going to pass away, and that through it all, God is going to hold you in the palm of his hand and show his glory through you. Now, this is obviously exactly what Jesus does, right? He sees the man, he spits on the ground, makes mud with his saliva, and puts it on the man's eyes, and then tells him to go wash. Now, just hear the wonderful creative overtones in this piece of the text. How did God create humanity? He took the dust of the earth, formed the man, and breathed the breath of life into him. Now what does Jesus do? He takes dirt from the ground, joins it with water from his spit, puts it on the man's eyes, sends him to water, tells him wash, and suddenly that man is able to see. What does that sound like? A new creation. A new creation done through baptism, which John has been reminding us of through his motif of water throughout this gospel. Jesus is showing my work comes through my word, through water. My recreative work, my redemption of people happens through water and the word. That's what happened for this man. He was affected by sin, but the glory of God was shown through him through Jesus' work with water. And so Jesus then sets us up for the rest of the text by saying, night is coming when no one can work. So while I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And as long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. In other words, he's saying, look, right now, I'm doing this. I'm the one who's taking water, working with my word, to show you the recreative power of God in the face of sin. But night is coming. There will be a time when there is no more chance to baptize. There's no more chance to preach. There's no more chances to show the glory of God because the world will come to an end. Until that comes, I am the light of the world. And then you are the light of the world when he ascends into heaven. And that's why he says very clearly to his disciples, we must do the work of him who sent me. Brothers and sisters, you may feel like an absolute disaster of a human being. You may look at your life and think it's just a mess. But God is using that for his glory, to bring people into his family, to shine the light of the world through you while it is still day, because night is coming when no one can work. Until then, let your weakness be your strength, because in those moments you rely on God more than anything else, more than yourself, more than anything that you possess. Those are the moments where God shines the most brightly. I pray that he does that in your life. Thanks for joining us today. If you like what we're doing, make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video, share the podcast, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to click on these links.